This is a NATO landing exercise in Sweden. Further south, soldiers move through trench lines, deploy from helicopters. These are U.S. and NATO troops battle-testing themselves as a possible confrontation with Russia looms in Eastern Europe.
My big worry here is the possibility of accident miscalculation when you have military forces operating in close proximity.
The Pentagon is considering sending hundreds of tanks, artillery, and other weapons to Vladimir Putin's doorstep, to the Baltic nations and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. A U.S. defense official tells CNN it'll be enough to outfit a brigade, up to 5,500 troops. The soldiers themselves won't be permanently stationed there, but the official says the equipment will be there to use in these kinds of training exercises. It's prompted a warning from Russia, its foreign ministry saying this could slide into, quote, a new military confrontation with destructive consequences. Putin has just announced he's adding over 40 new ballistic missiles to his nuclear arsenal.
If someone threatens some of our territories, we will have to aim our armed forces' modern attack capabilities at those territories which threaten us. What else can we do?
As both sides build up their forces, it's putting the region on edge.
Given the tempo of Russian military operations over the last year, you have more of those interactions, more possibilities for things to go wrong.
Putin's jets have played dangerous Cold War-style games with Western forces recently, one jet flying within 10 feet of a U.S. aircraft. Coming off an escalation of fighting in Ukraine between pro-Russian separatists and Ukrainian forces and Putin's aggressive deployment of weapons into Ukraine, the Baltic countries, NATO allies of the United States, are terrified that Putin will target them next.
They have every reason to be concerned that if Russia wants to gobble up some more perceived threats on their flanks, that they would be the first ones attacked.
And tonight, White House and NATO officials tell CNN they're concerned that Vladimir Putin and his army are violating their ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, stockpiling troops and weapons at the border, arming and training Russian separatists inside Ukraine, getting ready for possible action.
Many of their actions are consistent with preparations for another offensive.
Ukraine's president claims Putin has bolstered Russian troop numbers at the border to 50,000, that the separatists have about 40,000 inside Ukraine. There's been significant fighting reported by European monitors. Why would Putin be fueling this?
His approval ratings went through the roof as soon as Russia annexed Crimea, and they haven't gone down since. They're hovering around 86 to 88%. That's sort of totalitarian level approval ratings, and he is addicted to them.
Analysts say Putin believes he can do anything he wants in Ukraine, but that he's treading on dangerous ground.
There could be a serious miscalculation where Putin may actually think that there is much less likelihood of us taking action to things that he is doing. And I think there is a great deal of signalling going on in the United States, in Europe and in NATO, particularly these statements by General Breedlove and others, that, you know, if you keep pushing this, we will take action.
The Russians continue to deny any plans for military action. With all eyes on Putin's next strategic moves, rumors also circulate about his personal life. Recently, his assumed girlfriend, Alina Kabayeva, appeared in public. The former gymnast wore a loose-fitting red dress. Social media is buzzing with comments about her possible weight gain, and rumors that she recently gave birth have been rekindled.
They present him as very much the virile man about town, which is kind of like an image that a lot of Russian men like to aspire to.
Now, the Kremlin has never confirmed that Alina Kabayeva gave birth and has consistently dismissed talk of a romance between her and Vladimir Putin. But analysts say one reason Putin and his inner circle might not mind all of this speculation is because it distracts Russians from some of Russia's real problems.
I think this is part of our patriotic upbringing, says this spectator. People start taking pride in our country. The Kremlin has spent billions revamping its armed forces, even developing brand new weapons, like this T-14 battle tank on display here for the first time. It's the first new tank design to enter service in Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The annual Victory Day parade is meant to mark the Allied defeat of Nazi Germany in the Second World War. But it's also Russia's biggest, most important show of strength. A chance to parade its latest intercontinental ballistic missiles, a blunt reminder of Russia's powerful nuclear force. The decision by Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, to stage such a huge display of cutting-edge weapons this year is likely to be seen in the West as sending a powerful message about the Kremlin's determination to protect its power. Moscow is already under Western sanctions for its alleged support of pro-Russian rebels in neighbouring Ukraine. Most Western leaders invited to the Victory Day parade have chosen to stay away. Instead, the Western military alliance is bolstering its own defences, this week launching one of its biggest ever anti-submarine exercises in waters off Norway. A spate of incursions by suspected Russian subs in Scandinavian waters has put NATO on alert. In the skies too, Russia has been probing NATO defences. It's this reinvigorated Russian military that's set to be the showcase of this year's Victory Day parade. I feel proud for my country when I see all of these military vehicles, says Lydia, because I'm not afraid that someone might attack us. It's necessary for others to be afraid of us, she says. Many of Russia's neighbours watching events here closely already are. Matthew Chance,
General.
CNN.
Sir, as always, thank you for being here. This seems like a pretty dire warning from the Admiral. Russian missiles in range of the U.S., KH-101s. If they go operational, what then? Could that spark a new arms race of some sort?
Well, they will go operational. There's no doubt about that. And yes, there is an arms race that's coming. We just have to face the fact that Russia is coming back. Under Vladimir Putin, as President Obama said, he's got a foot firmly in the Soviet past. Now, all these bomber patrols are part of Putin's strategy. He wants to rebuild the Soviet space, so he's in Ukraine, but he wants to send a warning to the rest of the world about Russia's military power. And they're in about the 5th or 6th year of a major military overhaul that started after the Russian invasion of the former Soviet Republic of Georgia in 2008. So we've been involved in the Middle East. We're worried about ISIS. We're worried about terrorism. There are lots of threats. But this is a different kind of threat. This is a threat to the stability of the international order, to NATO, to the European Union, to the system of and structuring of the world that we've taken for granted since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Well, General, I can almost understand theoretically why Putin would have Russian fighter jets buzzing Poland, the Czech Republic, even Germany or France. But why North American airspace? What is he trying to say?
Well, what he wants to do is he wants to set the hook here that if we try to do something in response to his actions in Ukraine, or maybe further actions in, let's say, Lithuania, Latvia, or even Poland, that we'll be afraid in the United States to take action because he's been demonstrating his ability to reach out and touch us. This is, we would call it a flexible deterrent option. He would call it psychological warfare. He would call it hybrid warfare. They're attempting to impact our mentality right now. This broadcast, American people listening, fear. So the next time we want to confront Russia, you'll hear analysts speaking up, academicians speaking up and say, oh, no, no, let Russia have what it wants because, after all, they're a nuclear power. And so we have to have the means to counter his buildup of forces.
Right, but how do we do that?
Sometimes that's deterrence.
Well, how do we do that? Obviously,
yeah,
go.
We make sure that he doesn't have any nuclear capacities that we can't match. We have linkage between our first forces on the ground all the way back to the strategic nuclear threat that we pose to him with our missiles, submarines, and long-range bombers. And, as necessary, we build out our strategic missile and strategic bomber defense capacity.
All right, General Wesley
Like
Clark.
this one seen here was flying in international airspace north of Poland when the Russian jet intercepted it. A Pentagon spokesman says the Russian pilot acted, quote, unsafe and unprofessional because of close proximity and high rate of speed. Joining us right now to help break this down is Lieutenant General Mark Herdling on the phone with us. So help us understand, A, how this could happen if we're talking about over Poland airspace.
Fred, it shouldn't be happening, but we're seeing the EUCOM commander, General Breedlove, is seeing increasing incidents of this. The Russians have done almost 4 times as many of these kinds of incursions and challenges of aircraft, not only the United States but other NATO nations this year, a significant increase across the board. This is something that we have repeatedly claimed is dangerous because Russians are not only going up to our airplanes in a threatening manner, but they've also conducted some of these kinds of overflights of European territory without transponders on. So it's just a very dangerous set of circumstances, and I think it's Russia's way of showing NATO and the United States, we're going to do this because we can. You're not doing anything about it.
And let me correct myself. I said Poland, Russian space. It's international Russian space north of Poland. But, you know, if this is just kind of bullying in the air, if we think that's what this is, what is the ultimate goal? I mean, how does this advance Russia's cause or their position in the world? I mean, what would be the goal here?
Well, the goal is basically to threaten to say that they can do these kinds of things. And I think it's a direct response to Europe, threatening Russia with continued sanctions because of the Ukrainian issue. Russia is testing the water. It's Mr. Putin, actually, who's testing the water to see how far he can go. He's already had an incursion into the Donbass region in Russia. And I think, personally, that we will soon see, within the next month or two, some increasing Russian incursions into the Crimea. And, again, we have said sanctions against Russia are our only means of threatening them back. I think we've seen some military actions in the last few weeks where both the U.S. Army in Europe and the U.S. Air Force in Europe has spread their wings a little bit more and threatened back by conducting some operations, especially in countries along the Russian border, the Baltic countries, in Poland. And truthfully, all of those Eastern European countries are somewhat concerned about all this. They've seen this happen before with Russia, and they're not all that fired up about having this kind of actions by their neighbors to the east.
Foreign Office spokesperson here, and it fits into what they describe as part of an increasing pattern of out-of-area operations by Russian aircraft. A statement goes on to say, whilst the Russian planes didn't enter sovereign UK airspace and were escorted by RAF Typhoons throughout the time they were in the UK area of interest, the Russian planes caused disruption to civil aviation. The Russian ambassador was called into account for the incident, as they call it. After the meeting, the Russian embassy here said, on his part, Ambassador Alexander Yakovenko stressed that the concerns of the British side are not understandable, given that 2 Russian military aircraft were on a routine air patrol duty over the high seas of the Atlantic Ocean. This flight, as all other routine flights of the Russian military aircraft, was carried out in strict compliance with the international legal norms, including international flight rules and regulations, without violation of other countries' airspace. Therefore, it cannot be regarded as threatening, destabilising or disruptive. Nevertheless, NATO said on Friday it's watching Russian movements closely.
Last year, Allied aircraft intercepted Russian planes over 400 times. Over 150 of these intercepts were conducted by NATO's Baltic Air Policing mission. That's about 4 times as many as in 2013. So we are staying vigilant.
The Russian bombers flew closer to England than usual, apparently, and it wasn't seen as threatening, but it did cause disruption. The question quietly being asked here in London is whether this is really about messaging. President Putin reminding the West of his country's military might. Max Foster, CNN London.
Well, I think this goes well beyond Ukraine. It's part of a bigger master plan to restore a Russian zone of influence in the near neighborhood covering the former Soviet space. And therefore, the Russians want to keep their neighbors weak and dependent on Russia and prevent them from seeking Euro-Atlantic integration in the European Union and NATO. And that's why we see these conflicts not only in Ukraine but also in Moldova and Georgia.
Russia would probably argue it's NATO, it's the West that's breaking promises, edging closer to their borders, prodding, being the aggressor in this former sphere of influence. I mean, what would you say to that?
Such promises have never been given for the very reason that it is a fundamental principle that each and every nation has an inherent right to decide its security policy and alliance affiliation herself. Actually, all OSCE countries, including Russia, subscribed to that principle back in 1999. So it's for Ukraine, it's for Georgia and all other countries to decide whether they will seek integration with the European Union and NATO or not.
But if Russia crosses a so-called red line, what happens if there is some stirring up, say, in one of the Baltics, a NATO member? There's that collective security trigger. An attack against one is an attack against all. Do you really honestly think that a Cold War type showdown between East and West in Europe is likely? No one really wants that. No one can afford it, probably.
No one wants that, but actually the current crisis holds many features similar to what we saw during the Cold War. As regards NATO member states, no doubt that our collective defense it's strong. We are determined to defend any ally against any attack, and if the Russians were to attack a NATO ally, that would be crossing a red line. We would invoke Article 5 and defend that ally.
And do you think that is likely? I mean, you've spoken about spearhead forces, rapid reaction forces, but in reality, beyond the politics, do you think there is a likelihood of NATO forces clashing with Russian forces?
I hope not, and I think the best way to avoid that is to ensure that we have a strong deterrence so that we can deter any potential aggressor from attacking a NATO ally. And this is the reason why NATO at the summit in Wales in September decided to establish a very rapid reaction force, a spearhead force that can be deployed at very short notice, for instance in the Baltic states or anywhere in the East, if our allies are threatened.
I want to just quickly shift our thought. You've spoken about an arc of crisis. You were head of NATO during the Libya bombing campaign. Looking back now, do you regret it?
No, on the contrary. NATO conducted a very successful air campaign in Libya, fulfilling a United Nations mandate to protect the Libyan population against attacks from their own government. But I think the international community failed to follow up and, for instance, establish a peacekeeping or stabilization force in Libya and help the new authorities to build the new Libya. And now we see the consequences. Libya is pretty close to becoming a failed state, which is extremely dangerous because if ISIL gets a foothold in Libya, and in particular if they get access to oil revenue, that would further strengthen this terrorist organization very close to Europe's borders.
Okay, and then you're a man who's worn many hats. You were also a long time Prime Minister of Denmark. Looking at what happened in Copenhagen over the weekend, very much a legacy of the publication of those cartoons. You were Prime Minister during that. You had a very tough stance during that. What's your assessment of the last 10 years on that issue?
Well, what we saw a few days ago in Copenhagen was really a defining moment for Denmark. And it demonstrates that we have to maintain a high security alert, but it also demonstrates the need for improved integration policies. I think we should realize that integration is not just about providing jobs and education for immigrants. but it's also a value-based integration. The message should be very clear. You're welcome in our country if you want to work and contribute to our society, but you also have to accept fundamental values upon which we have built our society, including freedom of expression and protection of minorities, including the Jewish community.
The Budapest Memorandum said that Ukraine would give up all its nuclear weapons, and it had the third largest stockpile in the globe at that time, and it was getting assurances of security, of territorial integrity that were being assured by the United States, by Great Britain, and by Russia. By any measure, Russia has violated Ukraine's territorial integrity by going into Crimea, by having troops inside other parts of Ukraine. But at the same time, experts will also say that, well, the United States and Great Britain also gave guarantees there to help protect Ukraine. So in part, they have failed. Why are Germany and France taking the lead right now? Well, Germany and France both believe that a diplomatic solution is possible, based, it appears, roughly on the broad parameters of what was agreed in Minsk, the Minsk Protocol in September last year, that France and Germany both have economic interests in a long-term stable relationship with Russia. But the fundamental reason is that both Germany and France believe that this Minsk Protocol from September last year is salvageable, and they don't want to see a buildup of weapons and a greater instability of Europe. So what happens if there isn't a deal? Well, the bottom line is no deal potentially means an escalation of sanctions against President Putin and Russia and against the separatists that is backing. And if that doesn't work, there could well be a buildup of arms and weapons. The United States and potentially others supplying the Ukrainian government with what they call defensive weapons.
It's not so much that these Russian flights would pose a military threat to the United States. That's not going to happen. These are old, sort of cumbersome Soviet-era Bear bombers with, big propeller engines that make an awful lot of noise. They can carry nuclear missiles, of course. They're probably not going to be when they make these training flights, but they theoretically could. They pose more of a threat, I think, to civilian air traffic, because many times these Russian flights, which are of course on military manoeuvres, they don't turn their transponders on, they don't speak to air traffic control, which basically makes them invisible to the air traffic controllers and potentially could lead to a very close call in the skies. In fact, this has already happened once before in March, that's been recorded. An airliner, a civilian airliner taking off from Copenhagen in Denmark on its way to Rome, came in very close proximity to one of these Russian air patrols. Catastrophe was narrowly missed, but it does underline just how hazardous this increased presence in the skies by the Russian Air Force could potentially be.
But you should really look back 6 years ago to 2008 when Russia invaded another former Soviet state, Georgia. There's a view in Russia that that's when the world started taking Russia seriously again, because for years Russia had seen itself as being far behind, hopelessly behind the West in military terms, and that's a problem that Russia's leadership wanted to correct. In recent years, Russia has started what many military analysts call a massive rearmament. $730 billion over 10 years. In military terms, we're talking about 100 new warships, 600 new warplanes, 1,000 new helicopters to go along with what remains the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, larger even than the U.S. Now, the focus is not on another Cold War necessarily, really on what Russia calls the near abroad. Those are the former Soviet republics, like Ukraine, like Georgia, that Russia wants to expand, reassert its influence once again. And it feels it needs, in order to do that, to expand its military again. But you have to put this in a larger context. Today, Russia's military is about a fifth the size that it was during Soviet times. In terms purely of soldiers, there were 2 million soldiers in the Soviet army. There are about 800,000 in the Russian military today, but it has the intention of adding to those ranks, setting a goal of adding about 400,000 troops to the Russian military. What does this mean for U.S.-Russian military relations? Will it change the relationship? Very likely. And that is a risk that U.S. officials in the administration, in the State Department, and elsewhere are wrestling with today.